Okay, we are, if I did not mention it, we are in the offices of our department, the Department of Environment and Sustainability here at UB. And we're in one of our conference rooms doing this taping. And there's a nice poster on the wall here. Clean air, happy plants. That's a good thing. The plants they're showing here are called Hepaticus. And I thought I would just interject a little history for you here. Hepatica, you're seeing the flowers. If you were to see the leaves are actually lobed, and they look rather like a liver. And it brings to mind a historic connection to herbalism. So you see, herbs from their beginnings spoke to people. They spoke to individuals through a concept we call sympathetic magic. It's where it all begins. And you can appreciate people from ages past who lived close to the earth, who were a part of the earth, who believed that the earth was alive and speaking to them. Sympathetic magic is based upon this notion of one looking for similarities and contrasts and patterns in nature to speak of how a plant can be used for us, which is to say, how does that plant work in their environment, and we can translate to how that plant might work with us. It's like the earth whispering to us, giving us clues that we can look to the plants for healing or for food. So here with a plant whose leaves look like liver, the liver of a person, you associate this plant with using it for that purpose, for liver ailments. Likewise, if a plant has a sap that's red in color, that's nature's way. That's the earth's way of telling us that we can use that plant for our blood. If a mushroom is growing on a dead log, then use that mushroom to bring someone back to life. You better do so very carefully these days. As you well know, mushrooms can be very, very dangerous. But it's that notion of living on something dead to bring someone back to life. It's that connection. So you can look at a plant growing in a wall, a rock wall, and breaking the rocks apart. Use that plant to break up kidney stones in your body. If a plant has large spines that bring pain, use the fruit of that plant to reduce pain in your body. So it's a matter of understanding that the earth is alive, the earth speaks, and for those who know how to listen, you can translate the language of earth into the healing of humans. So all peoples began all over the world with this notion of sympathetic magic. That's at the root, no pun intended, at the root of herbalism everywhere around the world. And so the Hepatica reminds me of that. So I just wanted to share that notion with you. Later on, actually, in Western medicine, so we look towards Western Europe in particular, in the post-Renaissance period of the 17th, 18th centuries, this notion of sympathetic magic was actually vulgarized into the notion of the doctrine of signatures. And so it took on a more Christian perspective in that God stamps every plant with a sign, and it's that sign that speaks to us of what the plant could be used for. So it's an interesting notion, that of sympathetic magic evolving into the Christian-based doctrine of signatures. And actually, to complete that story, I should share this with you because in the late 1700s, in 1785, there was a backlash because this doctrine of signatures was not necessarily a healthy process. Many people suffered from it. The individuals who were treating people at that time were not necessarily as responsible as they should have been. And so there was this backlash. And we have an individual that comes forth. He was an English physician, William Withering. And in the year 1785, he started working with a plant called foxglove. Traditional healings with foxglove focused upon a disease called dropsy, where there would be retention of water in the body. And it was focused on allowing the kidneys to help release that excess fluid. And so people were taking the foxglove plant for that, and oftentimes it would heal them, but sometimes it would kill them. And you see, through his efforts of working with traditional healers and working with that particular plant, he isolated a compound from the foxglove plant called digitalis. And what he discovered was that the digitalis worked not specifically on the kidneys, but worked on the heart and sped up the heart. And in doing so, encouraged the kidneys to better clear out excessive fluid. And so he really is credited with shifting traditional healing methodologies into what became allopathic and Western medicine, where you isolate a compound, you concentrate it, you create a precise dosage with it. And here you have, if you will, the birth of Western medicine. So some advantages there and some disadvantages there. But we could really trace the line of sympathetic magic to the doctrine of signatures to what became modern Western medicine in its approach to healing. Thank you. All right, so now we're moving away from this notion of sympathetic magic. And I think to conclude, as you might suspect, in taking those lessons from the earth, people did appreciate the healers, that certain plants did in fact work very well, for certain aspects of our body in healing. And those are the ones that were perpetuated. Those plants, of course, that did not speak loudly and work well, they obviously would go to the wayside. But, what was learned was passed on, and we go from there. So, where that takes us is right now to some facts and figures. And just a few things I want you to be aware of relative to herbalism today. The first one is this. In third world countries around the world, approximately 3/4 of the medical needs of people living there are still met by off-the-tree medicines. So that is to say, a very large percentage of the world's population still depends wholly on herbalism to meet much of their medical needs. And they wouldn't be doing that, they wouldn't be using these medicines if they did not work. They do. And they work well. But you must realize that with many of these medicines, since, as I mentioned before, they're dealing with imbalances and oftentimes deficiencies, biochemical deficiencies in the body, they take a while to work. You have to be patient. You have to work with the herbs as opposed to them simply working on your body. And when you do that, then you have the potential to affect truly a healing. So the first figure that I wanted to share with you is this notion that around the world, there are people still depending upon these remedies as their primary source of medicine. Okay, secondly, I want you to realize that in the West, and this might be a surprise to you, but approximately 25 to 30% of the drugs used today still depend upon natural sources, most of them being plants, so that they can be developed. And the remainder of our drugs are essentially wholly synthetic, based upon the natural chemistry we find in nature. So that's how it works today. So still, in the US it's more like 25%, and in Western Europe it's more like 30% that still use plants. But please appreciate that plants and their chemistry are still a very important component of modern medicine. Many just don't realize that. So that's an important notion I want you to realize. And another one I want you to be aware of is this. There are probably about 300,000 plants that have been named on the planet at this point. Most botanists will tell you there's probably 750,000 to 1.25 million plants on the planet. In other words, we still have a lot of plants to discover, a lot of plants to name. And so we've got a long ways to go in that regard. Now, traditional medicines have, in the past and up to the present, used thousands of these plants, literally thousands of them. But, the question I would put to you, if we were together, would be, how many plants are used today in our modern medicines? And I'm sure your answers would be far-ranging. But in actuality, it's a little over 100 plants, providing us with about 120 some odd drugs that come from them. That's not very many. That tells us we have a long ways to go in terms of appreciating the plant world and appreciating the gifts they have to share with us. So I think that's a pretty incredible figure. Just a little over 100 plants with 120 drugs, with hundreds of thousands of plants out there yet to be discovered, at least for Western medicine. So, and I think it's interesting to appreciate that our search for these remedies really started beginning in the 70s. And there wasn't such a focus here in the US, but in Japan, in Russia, in Scandinavia, in other places in Western Europe, lots of ethnobotanists were heading out into the fields all around the world, speaking to indigenous peoples, learning about their medicines. And then, of course, what they would do is take those herbs back and would look to isolate and concentrate certain components so that drugs can be made. I mean, you have to look at the finances of the process. You cannot patent an herb, you see, but you can patent a drug. And the companies that sent people out needed to do that. And of course, this is part of the evolution of Western medicine. You isolate, you concentrate, you create the precise dosage. But it's interesting to note, the patent connection to it and the money connection to it. And the reason to this day that many of us still prefer the plant as an herb as opposed to the drug because of other things we've already discussed. So in terms of some facts and figures, I wanted you to be aware of some of those notions. It's important, I think, in the realm of herbalism.